You know what's fascinating? Research shows that 95% of our daily decisions happen completely unconsciously. We're basically running on autopilot most of the time without even realizing it.
That's such a striking statistic. It really makes you wonder how many of our choices aren't really choices at all.
And here's what's even more interesting. Neuroscience shows that our brain actually makes decisions several seconds before we become consciously aware of them. It's like we're watching a delayed broadcast of our own thoughts.
So, in a way, we're not really the authors of our own stories. That's kind of unsettling when you think about it.
Well, that's where it gets really fascinating. While we might not have direct control over those unconscious processes, we can actually rewire them through something called conscious character design.
Hmm, tell me more about that. How exactly does someone go about redesigning their character?
It starts with understanding what Carl Jung called our shadow self, that unconscious part of us that's actually driving most of our behavior. He famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate."
That's exactly what happens to so many people. They feel like they're just passengers in their own lives.
Right. And research shows there are actually four distinct types of self awareness. You've got the seekers, who are still trying to figure out who they are, the introspectors, who know themselves but never challenge their views.
And let me guess, there must be people who are too focused on how others see them.
Exactly. Those are the pleasers. But here's what's really interesting. Studies show that only about 10 to 15% of people fit into the fourth category, what we call the aware individuals who truly understand both themselves and how others perceive them.
That's such a small percentage. What makes it so difficult for people to develop that kind of complete self awareness?
Well, one major factor is that our limbic system, the emotional part of our brain, processes information about 80,000 times faster than our conscious mind. So we're literally feeling things before we can think about them.
You know what's fascinating about that? It explains why we sometimes make decisions that logically don't make any sense to us later.
And that's where psychometric testing comes in. These tests can actually map out our unconscious biases and patterns. For instance, the Myers Briggs test identifies 16 distinct personality types, each with their own default decision making patterns.
Though I imagine some people might be skeptical about putting themselves in a box like that.
That's a great point. But here's the thing, these tests aren't about limiting ourselves, they're about understanding our starting point. It's like trying to use GPS without knowing your current location.
So it's more like creating a baseline for personal growth.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is how our unconscious patterns show up in unexpected places. For instance, research shows that your favorite movie character often reflects your own self image.
That's incredible. So our entertainment choices are actually giving us clues about our deeper selves.
Yes, and it goes even further. Studies show that your YouTube viewing history, spending patterns, and even the books you actually finish reading versus the ones you abandon create a detailed map of your true interests.
It's like we're leaving psychological breadcrumbs everywhere we go.
And here's where it gets really powerful. Once you understand these patterns, you can actually design a new character for yourself. It's not about forcing change, it's about becoming the person who would naturally achieve your goals.
That reminds me of the concept of neuroplasticity, how our brains can literally rewire themselves based on repeated patterns.
Precisely. And research shows it takes about 31 days of consistent practice to start rewiring those neural pathways. That's why the most successful people often have such rigid morning routines.
Though I imagine the hardest part isn't knowing what to do, but actually sticking with it long enough to see results.
That's where understanding your limbic system becomes crucial. Instead of fighting against your emotional brain, you can actually work with it by creating positive associations with new behaviors.
So it's like becoming the architect of your own character development.
Yes, and what's fascinating is that this approach is backed by neuroscience. When we consciously practice new behaviors while maintaining positive emotional states, we create stronger neural pathways much faster.
That's why affirmations and visualization aren't just feel good exercises, they're actually rewiring our brains.
Exactly. And studies show that combining physical action with mental rehearsal is actually 45% more effective than either one alone. It's why top athletes use both physical practice and visualization.
This whole approach really turns traditional self help on its head, doesn't it?
It does, because instead of trying to achieve specific goals, we're focusing on becoming the person who would naturally achieve those goals. It's like changing the operating system instead of just downloading new apps.
That's such a powerful metaphor. And I suppose once you become that person, the achievements almost become inevitable.
That's exactly right. And what's really interesting is that research shows successful people often report feeling like their achievements were natural or inevitable because they had already become the person capable of those achievements.
It's almost like they're working with their unconscious mind instead of against it.
And that's really the key takeaway here. Self awareness isn't just about understanding who you are, it's about consciously choosing who you want to become. It's about taking the steering wheel of your own development.
Well, this has certainly given me a lot to think about in terms of my own personal growth journey.
And remember, as the research shows, it's not about forcing change, it's about understanding yourself deeply enough to design and grow into the person you want to become. That's where true transformation begins.